In these times during COVID, when we're all sitting at home, it's sort of like a ray of light that we get to watch these amazing sessions when we can't all be together. It certainly brightens up my evenings.
आज पेंडेमिक में हम डिजिटली जयपुर लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल कर रहे हैं और मुझे लगता है कि हमारे सामने श्रोता नहीं है, हम आपस में बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उस फील को, उस उमंग को महसूस कर सकते हैं कि हजारों लाखों लोग हमसे जुड़े हुए हैं, हमको सुन रहे हैं और कहीं ना कहीं कोई एक सार्थक हस्तक्षेप हो रहा है.
People who came online to view and listen to our incredible speakers from across the world, we were able to continue in our tradition of ensuring the free flow of knowledge and information. Our love and prayers for all of those who have been impacted by the second deadly wave of COVID-19. Even in these difficult times, we wish to continue with our vision to ensure the free flow of knowledge and information to address so many vital questions of our times through our digital series. On behalf of Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to the Jaipur Literature Festival Digital Series 2021. This evening, we present Yasodhara and the Buddha, Vanessa R. Sasson in conversation with Amanda Lou Deckelbaum. At a time when women are increasingly reclaiming their narratives, Vanessa R. Sasson's recent book, Yasodhara and the Buddha, is an evocative story of the life of Buddha as seen from the eyes of his wife, Yasodhara. This transformative tale gives us an understanding of Yasodhara's joys and sorrows, her expectations and frustrations as she watches her beloved husband walk away. Vanessa R. Sasson is a professor of religious studies at the Marianopolis College. She's also a research fellow at the University of the Free State and research member for CERIAS at UQAM. Sasson has a long academic publishing record. Yasodhara and the Buddha is her first novel. Amanda is a Montreal-based creative. She's a writer, a student of art and wellness, and the lead project manager for SoundFood, the podcast hosted by Nitsa Citrine, exploring the questions, how do we find and feel resonance today? As you're all aware, all our sessions that have been broadcast till now have been archived and are available on this site at the Mughal Tent venue. And also, of course, on our Facebook page, Jaipur Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Yasodhara and the Buddha, Vanessa R. Sasson, in conversation with Amanda Lou Deckelbaum. Amanda, Vanessa, over to you.
Hi.
Hello. Nice to see you, Amanda.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, and it's so nice to be back with JLF. Hello, JLF. I wish I was there in person, but I'm so glad to participate again.
So
How
nice.
you doing, Amanda?
Yes. I'm doing great. I'm excited to ask you all these questions.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay. So I think before we go in on your beautiful book, let's start by just discussing the overall story arc and flow of Yasodhara's life for anyone who hasn't heard the story before, and then we'll take it from there.
Sounds good. So this book that I've written is called Yasodhara and the Buddha, and it is based on many years of research. I am a scholar of Buddhist studies in Montreal, Canada, and I have spent the bulk of my career studying the early Indian Buddhist narratives about the Buddha's life. And a few years ago, I wanted to write about the Buddha's life, but I was focusing my research on Yasodhara. And the interesting thing is that many people don't seem to know that much about her. People know, they hear about Yasodhara, they know that the Buddha was married, but there's not that much imagination when it comes to who she was. And what is so interesting is that when you look at the research, there are so many early stories about her, that she was a really important character. She wasn't just a wife who was there on the side to prove that the Buddha was married before he became the Buddha. I mean, he wasn't the Buddha yet, he was a bodhisattva, but it's a technicality we don't need to worry about right now. But she wasn't just kind of a staple wife that was there and, you know, to prove that he did this. She actually has a really important role to play, and she has a character, and she has been there for a really long time. But people don't always engage with her. And so I thought it was really important to spend some time talking about her and writing her story so that we can get to know her a little bit more. And it changes how we understand the Buddha's life story, and maybe even how we engage with Buddhism. So when I started looking at her story, what I found is that her story obviously doesn't begin with when she's born. If we think about Indian storytelling is so much bigger than just one moment, right? Indian storytelling goes through lifetimes and lifetimes. It spans generations. I mean, stories are big and they're vast and they're cosmic and they're exciting and they take their time. And Buddhist storytelling coming out of India is very similar, so that we have the Buddha's life story goes from hundreds of thousands of lifetimes ago all the way through time until he becomes the Buddha. And then there's even stories of after his death where his story actually continues in the shape of relics. So when we talk about the Buddha's life story, we're talking about this really long cosmic narrative that goes for eons and eons and eons. It's not this short little clip. The life story of the Buddha, as we tend to tell it, is this last, it's almost like the last scene in a really long movie. And Yasodhara is there through this whole cosmic story. And so when you talk about the Yasodhara's life story, what I was finding was it's not to tell the story right from when she's born. Her story begins eons ago, right? And so that she is there with him, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, evolving next to him. And this to me was a beautiful feature of her life story that just needed a moment of consideration. What it meant to me was that if the Buddha's wife, Yasodhara, is there lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, so that the two of them are together over and over and over again through all these stories, it means she's much more important than just a token wife. There's a sense almost, and this is a very modern thing for me to say, but I feel as though you can almost say that she's like his partner, that there's a kind of, there's a collective experience. The two of them are going through their lives lifetime after lifetime, and in each story of these past lives, which are called the Jatakas, in each of these stories, when he has a wife, it's her. So it's not he's randomly married to other women. She specifically shows up and is married to him over and over and over again. And so to me, this was a sense of this kind of long relationship. And if you read the Jatakas, what you find is it's not a static relationship. She's not always there in the same experience, but that they have a different type of relationship in each of these lifetimes. So there's this evolution and this change and this multiplicity of their relationship. And so they go through all these lifetimes of relationships together, where sometimes, you know, he's trying to become a monk and she's chasing him down in the forest, begging him not to go, which sounds very much like her last life story. And then there's other stories where he's literally moving mountains to go find her, that he adores her and he's chasing her down and he's trying to find her and to get her to marry him. And so it seems to me that what we're talking about is a very romantic, long story of connection. And in their final lives, when you dig a little bit in the literature, what you discover is that in their final lives, there's this passage that comes up in Pali text, Sanskrit text, Chinese text, Tibetan text. I kept coming across this one line that when he took his final rebirth, a few other beings took their rebirth with him. And one of those great beings was her. And so not only did they do this whole journey of all of these lifetimes together, but then she's reborn with him, so that they're co-reborn. They're reborn as partners together in their final lifetime. And for me, this information, even before we get to this final story, was really evidence that this is a story that has to be told, that needs to be honored, that she is important. And we have bypassed her. We have not given her any real credit. Even though in the literature she's there, the early writers did not bypass her. But in the contemporary period, we seem to have forgotten her. And so my goal with this book was to find her again and tell this story of this really important character that has been there right from the beginning. When she's finally reborn with him, She's reborn at the same instant, in the same kingdom, as the man who will be her great beloved husband. And they grow up, according to some sources, as cousins. Most sources will identify them as cousins, living in the same realm, growing up in the same world. His world, though, as most of the audience members I'm sure know, is very restricted because he is the prince of a great kingdom. And his father, King Suddhodana, is terrified of his son leaving because a prediction was made when he was born that one of two possible outcomes would be his life. And one of the outcomes was that his son would become the greatest king that anyone would have ever known, that he would make peace with neighboring kingdoms, that he would rule justly, that everyone would be well in his kingdom. Or he would grow up to become a religious mendicant, a great religious teacher. And the king, the father, is devastated at the prospect that his prince, his son, would become a king, would become a religious teacher. And so he does everything in his power to shut down the palace, to give his son no opportunity to experience suffering. Because as he realizes, when you engage with suffering, that's when we become philosophical. That so long as we have everything that we want in the material world, we're comfortable in the material world. But when we lose that comfort, we start to wonder to ourselves, is there something more for me to hang on to? Right? It's a question that I think, with the pandemic and with all of our suffering that we're experiencing as a collective, we're more aware of than we've ever been before, is that we're starting to really wonder, I hope, is there more to this life than consumerism and capitalism and hoarding resources, or is there something else for me to do? Or is this all that I have? So the king knows this, he has this great insight, and he decides that if his son never sees suffering, if he's closed into his palace with only beautiful, wonderful things, he will never become religious. And then his son will be exactly what he wants him to be. So our poor Prince Siddhartha grows up in a palace completely closed off. Yasodhara doesn't have this life. So I imagine her, she grows up, we don't really know how she grows up because the literature doesn't tell us, but she doesn't grow up in the palace. So she has some relative freedom by comparison. Eventually, though, they're going to be married, right? So we're going to move forward through their lives. We don't really know how this is planned, except that there is a wonderful romantic scene in the early stories in which the ministers of the king say, we have to get the prince married. And Siddhartha wasn't interested. He was already philosophical, even if he was trying, even if he was avoiding suffering. And so the ministers say, we have to get him married. And so what they do in this very Cinderella-like moment is they summon all the ladies of the land to come and present themselves to the prince. And he is to give a piece of jewelry to each one. And so all the women come, and he has this big casket of jewels, and he just hands over one piece of jewel after another, and is not interested in any of the women. And the last one in line, because she's last, which in my imagination means she's late, which I relate to because I'm late for everything. So I love, you know this, you've seen me in class, I'm always late. And so I love that Yasodhara is like the last one in the line who, like, I imagine her just running in late and chaotic. She presents herself to the prince. And we don't know why, we don't know what happened before, but they did know each other. So I can imagine all kinds of things. Some kind of, attraction across a garden or something, or just they grew up together knowing each other and were friends. But they see each other and he wants to choose her, except, and here's the great suspense of the story, he looks in his casket and there are no more jewels. And so then he takes off his own necklace and he places it on her neck. And this is his way of saying she will be his bride. And so now we have this wonderful fairy tale romantic wedding where the future Buddha, we don't know he's going to be a Buddha yet, is going to marry Yasodhara. So they get married, and now we think we're at the happily ever after moment. And of course, we all know that's not how the story goes. And one day he escapes the palace and he sees suffering for real, right? And so he goes out in the streets and he sees old age and sickness and death, and he's devastated by it. And it shakes him to the core, and he comes back. And it is the day that she has given birth to their one and only child, their son. And according to one text, he goes to see her and she's sleeping with her son in her arms. And he's already decided he can't come back to this life. He has seen sickness. He has seen death. His life will never be the same again. He's not, this material world isn't doing it for him. So he has made the decision. And he goes to see her. And in my imagination, with the text don't tell us why, but I wondered, did he want to talk to her about it? Why did he go to her room? But he goes to her room and she's asleep and he sees his son. And this is the most dramatic moment of Yasodhara's life. This is the scene, this is the experience that has made me want to write this book. He sees her and he thinks, if I touch my son, she will wake up. And then I won't be able to go. And so again, this really does point to a sense of connection between these two characters. And so he doesn't dare touch his son. And he turns around and he walks away. And he leaves and he gallops off on his great adventure and doesn't come back to the palace for years and years and years. And she, in the meanwhile, wakes up the next morning to discover that her beloved husband is gone. And it is Yasodhara's sense of loss that to me is the most poetic, the most human, the most beautiful of the literature. Because then we have poet after poet of this literature that takes some time to express her loss and her sadness as she loses her beloved. And the poetry is so heartbreaking and so beautiful. And you have such a sense of how much she loved him and all the loss that she feels. And it is the most human part of the Buddhist story. So he goes off and he becomes the Buddha and he's the great hero. And we might aspire to become like the Buddha. But it's hard to relate to because he's so above the ordinary experience in the Buddhist imagination. But her story, her loss, as she wakes up to discover with her newborn son in her arms and she discovers he's gone. After lifetimes of being together, after lifetimes of this experience of taking rebirth together in this magical imagination, then being married and being together in this palace, this bizarre palace that they were in, where all the doors were closed and all the gates were locked and they were just really the two of them. And she finally has a son to share with her husband. And she wakes up and he's gone and he doesn't even say goodbye. Her suffering is such a powerful moment in Buddhist storytelling. And it seemed to me it was worthy of a book. That's it, I'm done now.
I'm so
It's so emotional when I talk about it. It upsets me so still. Talking about it for years and writing about it and thinking about it, and I see her and I feel her pain, and it needs to be looked at. It needs to be thought about.
Okay, receiving. I have two questions that sparked my mind when you were speaking, and I want to just backtrack a little bit before I get into the second one. So the first one is about kind of the structure, the way that you wrote the book. You call it hagiographical fiction, and you touched a little bit about, what that means in terms of collecting imaginary, but also using these historical texts. And I'm just curious to know if you can give a definition of that fun term that you've created, so that we can gauge a little bit more about how you came up with this marvelous book.
Well, so it is a term I made up, hagiographical fiction. One of the questions I get all the time is this historical fiction? I would love to say it is, but I can't, because all the literature that we have that comes out of early Buddhism is easily 300, 400, 500 years after the period when we think the Buddha would have lived. So I can't talk about historical fiction because I have no resources from his time period. I have all these hagiographies. So hagiography is a sacred telling of a saint's life, right? So when you tell the story of the Buddha from a devotional perspective, which is what all of this literature is, the early writings, it's a devotional narrative. It's not based on history. It's based on the love and devotion of a community that has been telling these stories for a long time. We have so many of these hagiographies. I don't know that it's historical. I don't even want to argue about it. Like, it's not, to me, it doesn't matter whether it's historical or not. What we have is a vast wealth of early sources that try to create this story of the Buddha's life. There's not one text. So it's not like Western traditions where you have a Bible and everything kind of spins around that text. We have just layers and layers of poets and writers telling the story of the Buddha. And so what I felt like I did was I was collecting all of this wonderful material, reading it and exploring it and thinking about it, and then creating a new version, a new story from the 21st century from my voice, right? So I'm creating a fictional account that is built on these devotional texts. And that's why I called it hagiographical fiction.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So my next question is, how did you learn to delineate between all of these varying renderings of this story and sort of pick and choose which pieces resonated? And what is the role of a scholar when doing a project like this?
Well, I am a scholar, and my scholar is the training that has prepared me to do this kind of work. And I've been doing this work for over 20 years, reading these texts, studying them, analyzing them, describing them, placing them, negotiating all of this literature, which is a whole conversation in of itself. But this book isn't a book of scholarship. It's a book that is informed by scholarship, that is built on a foundation of my training. But this book is fiction. This is a book of my imagination that is the product of all my work before. I was reading, Umberto Eco is, I'm sure, how could you not know Umberto Eco? He is a wonderful writer. I take such hope because he was a scholar, I think of linguistics, and he wrote his first novel, The Name of the Rose, when he was 50. So I think that's very exciting. And so he talks about himself when he's in his 60s as a young novelist, which it makes me very happy. And I recently came across a collection of essays that he wrote about writing fiction. And he says there's no difference between writing fiction and writing scholarship, because to be a good scholar, you have to be a creative thinker. And to be a good writer, a good creative writer, you have to be well informed. And so the either or dichotomy of fiction and scholarship on some level doesn't exist. As a form and as a methodology, it does. With a peer review process, there's all kinds of things stylistically and methodologically that are different. But they're not as different as I think I used to imagine they were. So I would say that the book is a book of fiction, but is informed by 20 years of scholarship.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And you can really feel that with the tenderness of the writing and of the storytelling, that it feels like there was so much care and so much thoughtfulness and so much research. So thank you. So you touched a little bit about the emotional reaction that you still feel as you tell the story of Yasodhara. And I'm certain that so many people growing up with this story being told to them as children, rehearing this story, rereading this story, all of the different renderings, hold it with such closeness. And I'm curious to know how you navigated, this very well-rounded and mosaic-like storytelling, and how you held the responsibility of retelling that story, and how you decided that you were allowed to, and what would be the new offering you would bring to it.
It's a really important question. It's a question that I wrestled with for a long time, is, am I allowed to do this? Can I do this? Like, I know that I can write scholarship because it's my formal training, it's my category in the world, it's my, doctorates, it's my whatever, it's all of my status symbols, right? So I'm allowed to write scholarship in some kind of fabricated universe. But to write fiction about a sacred text is a different kind of experience, and I had a sense of I've always felt a tremendous sense of responsibility with all the work that I do, because when you work in the field of religious studies, it's not mathematics. This is not something that's kind of always true and always the same way. Religion is dear. It is personal. It is intimate. So even as a scholar, it's a very important part of our training is to learn to be very careful and thoughtful about every step of your way. As a scholar, what are the subjects you're going to study? How are you going to study them? How are you going to speak about them? Because it's not neutral territory. This is alive. It's not something that's gone. It's not a relic. It's not archaeology that belongs to the past. It belongs to the present. And it means so much to so many people. If you can't care about it and hold it with some tenderness, you're going to hurt everybody. And I don't think that tends to be productive. So I have no interest in doing that. Maybe some people do, but I have no interest in doing that. And so I have never treated my scholarship that way. And that carries over into the work of fiction, is that I was very, very conscious right through that this is a story that if I take on telling it in a popular way, it's going to reach a different audience. I have to be just as careful, if not more so, and just as tender in my relationship to the material, but also honest, right? This has to be sincere. I have to really say what I see in it. Otherwise, what am I doing? So I was wrestling with all of this for a very long time. I tried very hard for a very long time throughout my writing process to be gentle and respectful, but I was struggling with the question of the Buddha leaving. This is, to me, the reason I wrote the book, is he leaves her. He leaves her the day she gives birth. As a mom, this is devastating. And this is a story that so many women have lived. So, and her loss is so palpable in the literature, right? The sense of, in some texts, she has, one of the earliest texts, her rage in Ashvaghosha's Bodhicharita, she has such rage. She's not some meek little what's it called? Wallflower? What are those? That's a wallflower.
Yes.
Right? She's not like a nothing character that's against the wall. She has things to say. She goes to see the chariot driver and she points her finger at him and she says, "How dare you take him away from me?" And then he said, "But I had no choice." And she says, "Didn't you tell him about me? I'm important. Why didn't you tell him about me?" And he says, I told him, I said, "You have a beautiful wife, don't leave her." But he was determined. And so you have such a sense of her hardship and her sense of betrayal and her loss. And I feel that when I read literature. When I read Ashvaghosha, I feel the sadness of it. And I'm sad with her, right? But I also had to come to terms with it. So there's just all of these different personal emotional experiences I had to go through to be able to write the book so that I could not feel that sense of betrayal by the end of the experience. So I had all of that I was negotiating within myself, combined with my awareness that this story is really important to a lot of people. And I didn't want to step on it. I didn't want to hurt it. I wanted to engage it. It was a genuine engagement. And I thought, this is something that the tradition has been doing forever. When you look at how Buddhism is set up with thousands and thousands of texts, every generation writing their new text, everywhere Buddhism goes, there are new texts that come with it. So that we have Chinese Buddhist texts and Korean Buddhist texts, and each one of them in the voice of that culture and that time. And so I feel as though the tradition is not even just saying it's okay. There's an invitation from Buddhism to participate in the storytelling. And so it felt like an invitation that I was welcome to try to tell the story again. And I think great traditions have great stories that are never finished, that we have to tell our stories over and over again. We can't just say, well, Ashvaghosha in the 2nd century, he's got it. He did a beautiful job. We're done. He did. He's a masterpiece of writing. But we're not done. We have to tell the story again because each one of us lives this story. Each one of us can understand, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but in my head, I think everyone can understand running away and trying to do something extraordinary like the Buddha. Like just getting on your horse and charging off into the forest and saying, I'm done with this. I can understand that. I feel like it's an aspiration. It's extraordinary. But then I can also understand wanting to throw everything against the wall and feeling betrayed because we've all been there too. Every aspect of this story, I understand because it is so human and I have to digest it in myself. I have to know this loss and I have to know that aspiration. So I have to tell the story again.
I think one of the things that struck me was you mentioned, before you dive into the whole narrative, that there are so many mentions of her, but no one ever really dives in deep besides these poets who have these emotive expressions of her experience in isolation. I'm wondering why there isn't more literature on Yasodhara from your perspective.
Well, in the ancient, like in the Buddhist tradition, the story is about the Buddha. It's not about her, right? So I think that makes sense. What's fascinating is that even though the tradition's about the Buddha, there is so much material about her too. What's exciting about this moment right now is that we are starting to pay attention to her. And I think it's not just her. We're starting to realize, I think this is part of kind of the awakening of feminism and of everything else, that there are other voices to hear that we have not been listening to. And we're seeing this also with the Mahabharata and with the Ramayana, and we're getting stories told about the women characters that is showing us the story from a new perspective. And we're listening to voices maybe we didn't think to listen to before, which is often women. And I think that's really exciting. I think it's the time for it. And what is so exciting is that when you hear it from her perspective, the story is totally different. And that teaches us something new, right? When we tell the story from the Buddha's perspective, it's this heroic quest to engage with suffering and to overcome it. And he does. And it's so inspiring. And that story has been being told for 2,500 years. And we have to keep telling that story because I think we want to overcome. None of us wants to suffer. We're all suffering way too much right now, and we don't want it. So this is a story to listen to and be inspired by and to try to emulate. But her story is also a story that we have to listen to, because when somebody charges off into the sunset and runs away, I realize for many Buddhists that's a pretty derogatory thing to say, but he does escape the material world to do something else. You break everybody's heart. And there's no way around that. This is samsara. He does something great. He does something heroic. We don't want him to do anything differently, but we have to also recognize that by doing it, he devastated everybody. All the people that were depending on him, the king, the subjects, the king, the throne, his responsibilities, his mother. I mean, the stories of Gotami, there are stories of her, the stepmother who raises him, Mahapajapati. She cries so much at his departure that her eyes are covered in scales, right? His horse, who takes him off into the sunset, dies of heartbreak when he's not allowed to go with him. Everyone is heartbroken because they all want him to stay. Right. And when we look at the story from their perspective, we remember that everything has a cost, and suffering, even when the Buddha takes off and goes to do that, until we become awakened, we suffer that he left. And the tradition allows for that. The tradition doesn't hide it. It doesn't say, oh no, everybody was happy and everything. Sing Kumbaya. These early writers were so sophisticated in their capacity to engage with the suffering of everyone else as the Buddha goes off, or the future Buddha, the Bodhisattva, goes off to achieve this. And so you have this great thing on one, like the balance right? On one side, you have them going off doing something amazing. You also have all the costs that are being paid. And the tradition says, look at this too. Everything has a cost. Life is still suffering. Life is still difficult, right? And the best we can do is try to overcome it in our minds. And this is the part that's really important about her, is that at the end of the story of Yasodhara, she eventually leaves the palace too. And she goes on her own. She walks away because she understands eventually, I'm not going to find enduring happiness in a palace. It's not here. And so in the end, she follows in his footsteps and she goes for that quest for awakening too. And the tradition has this woman doing this, that women too, and we have to remember that, also go into the forest, even though it's even more dangerous for women and more scary for women due to obvious physical factors. She goes off with all that courage and all of that aspiration to overcome suffering in her own mind. And so she becomes a hero. She's not just about brokenness and loss, but she goes through it. She goes through all the brokenness, all the loss, and then she comes out the other side. And in that sense, she's an extraordinary hero. He's not the only hero of the story. I would almost say, but I'll get in trouble with this, she's a greater hero than I'm going to get in so much trouble for saying that, but she's such a hero. Look at all the challenges she faced. And she found her way to the other side.
Thank you. I so appreciate the strength that you illuminate in this forgotten narrative. So we have time for one more quick question.
Okay.
And my last question to you would be, who did you write this story for?
I wrote it because I had to. I wrote it because I needed to figure out why he left her and how she managed to overcome that suffering. I needed to see her. So I wrote it for me because I needed to do this. But then once it was written, I had to recraft it knowing that others were going to read it. So it changed at that point. But really, it was my quest in all truth and honesty. And I think most of the time when we write, if it's not coming from a need deep inside, it's not going to, like, I really wrote it because I had to. That's the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.
So lovely.
Thank you, Vanessa and Amanda, for that brilliant session. I mean, in this time of suffering and great despair, the way Yasodhara has sort of, been able to deal with the situation and the way that you've been able to put that down is absolutely fantastic. Thank you both so much for this fabulous session. Thank you all for being such a great audience and watching. And I do hope you're going to be back to watch our next session, which is Kabir Bedi in conversation with Mayank Shekhar in Stories I Must Tell. Meanwhile, given the second and the most virulent outwave, we again face an unprecedented and heartbreaking challenge. We've launched an emergency fund to provide artists and artisans support with a range of resources from food and rations to healthcare and medicines. You can contribute by pressing the contribute button on the left or the right-hand side of your screen. On behalf of all of us, stay safe, stay double-masked. See you at 8:30 p.m. IST for our next session.
In these times during COVID, when we're all sitting at home, it's sort of like a ray of light that we get to watch these amazing sessions when we can't all be together. It certainly brightens up my evenings.
आज पेंडेमिक में हम डिजिटली लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल कर रहे हैं और मुझे लगता है कि हमारे सामने श्रोता नहीं है, हम आपस में बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उस फील को, उस उमंग को महसूस कर सकते हैं कि हजारों लाखों लोग हमसे जुड़े हुए हैं, हमको सुन रहे हैं और कहीं ना कहीं कोई सार्थक हस्तक्षेप हो रहा है.
People who came online to view and listen to our incredible speakers from across the world, we were able to continue in our tradition of ensuring the free flow of knowledge and information.